Good evening, everyone. My name is Christian Parker. I'm a professor of professional practice in the theater program at Columbia University School of the Arts. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm excited to talk about this piece uh, and welcome our guests in just a moment. As you probably know, this is part of the Complex Issues series in the School of the Arts, which is an opportunity for us to engage the work of faculty who teach here. It's part of the large, and this particular conversation is part of the spring 2022 public programs and engagement series, all centered on the theme of repair. And the series on repair is described as conversations, screenings, readings, installations, and performance explore creative practices that engage social and political initiatives committed to reimagining and transforming frayed relationships between humans, other species, the planet, and ourselves. So it's pretty broadly defined, but this play certainly encapsulates those ideas. Before we proceed, I wanted to just read the Columbia University School of the Arts land acknowledgement, which reads, Columbia University School of the Arts recognizes Manhattan as part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape and Wappinger people. By acknowledging legacies of displacement, migration, and settlement, we are taking a small first step toward the long and overdue process of healing and repair. The School of the Arts continues to confront and address issues of exclusion, erasure, and systematic discrimination through ongoing education and commitment to equitable representation. I also wanted to have a special thanks before I continue too far of Carol Becker, the Dean of the School of the Arts, and also to Gavin Browning in the Dean's office, who's really done great work putting this together. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guests who will be joining us this evening in just a moment when they cue them to turn on their cameras. Lynn Nottage is the first woman in history to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes for drama. Her plays have been produced widely in the United States and throughout the world. Recent work of hers includes the libretto for Intimate Apparel, the production we'll be discussing tonight, and the libretto for the musical MJ on Broadway right now. Clyde's, which recently closed on Broadway at Second Stage, and she recently also co-curated the performance installation The Watering Hole at Signature Theater. Other plays of hers include the musical adaptation of The Secret Life of Bees, recently at the Atlantic Theater Company, Malima's Tale, Sweat, which won the Pulitzer Prize, Obey Evening Standard Award, and the Susan Smith Blackburn Prize, By the Way, Meet Vera Stark, Ruined, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and Obie Alortel at the New York Drama Critics Circle Award, Adelco Awards, Drama Desk and OCC Awards, Intimate Apparel. And she's worked in television on She's Gotta Have It for Netflix, and as a consulting producer on Dickinson for Apple TV Plus. She is the winner of many, many awards and honors, including the Penn Laura Pell's Master Dramatist Award, the Doric Duke Artist Award, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award. She is a MacArthur Genius Grant Fellow. She is an associate professor at the Columbia University of the School of the Arts, and is a member of the Dramatists Guild, and I'm happy to consider her a friend and a longtime colleague. Ricky Ian Gordon is a New York-based composer and writer whose works have been performed at Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall, and all over the US and Europe. He is known primarily for his vocal works, operas, songs, and musicals, is widely recorded and published, and has won many awards. Recently, within 1 week, he premiered 2 new operas in New York City, the one we're discussing tonight, and The Garden of Finzi Contini's with librettist Michael Corey for the New York City Opera and the Yiddish Volksbühne. About his work, the New York Times has this to say: if the music of Ricky Ian Gordon had to be defined by a single quality, it would be the bursting effervescence infusing songs that blithely blur the lines between art song and the high-end Broadway music of Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim. It's caviar for a world gorging on pizza.
Mhm.
I'd like to welcome Lynn and Ricky to the conversation tonight. And I wanted to sort of pass the torch quickly before we get into their presentation to Lynn to give us a little bit of an introduction to the sort of the provenance of this piece, but by way of the provenance of the play also, and to tell us a little bit about the story of the play and sort of the origin of this project and adapting this play that
Well, thank you, Christian. I'm really happy to be here with the Columbia community. It's been some time, and I guess I consider Intimate Apparel to be my breakthrough play. It was the first play that I wrote after the death of my mother, who had ALS, which really robbed her of the ability to speak. So just at a moment when I had all of these questions to ask about my ancestors, she wasn't in the position to answer them, and she actually died young. And around the same time, my grandmother was battling with alcoholism and the beginnings of senile dementia, and I had to move her from her home where she had lived for over 50 years into my brother's house. And in the process, I had to go about the business of just going through 50 years of living. And she kept all of the family photographs in the pages of magazines as if she was literally trying to will us into the archive. And unfortunately, I didn't discover this until well after I had thrown out, I think, three-quarters of the magazines, which it was kind of a shocking discover. But I was really fortunate to find this one picture in the pages of a Family Circle magazine that I came across, which was a photograph of my great-grandmother. And in it, she was holding my mother and her sister, and it was the photograph that they used as a passport picture. And I realized that I had never seen my grandmother before until that very moment, and I knew very little about her other than the fact that she was a seamstress and she made intimate apparel, and that she had come to New York at the turn of the century by herself at 18 years old. And soon after that, she had begun corresponding with a man in Panama who she had connected with through her church, and he ultimately came back to New York City and became, the founding of my family. He was my great-grandfather. And looking at this photograph, I realized just how incredibly reticent my family had been about sharing the past, and I don't know whether that's because they really didn't deem the stories important enough to share, or whether at the time they thought there was going to be many more years in which they can impart sort of the ancestral history, but it didn't happen. And so I really was left with all of these questions and no one to answer them. And so the only thing that I could do was go to the public library and research. And I spent about a year in the public library on 42nd Street and up at the Schomburg on 135th Street, trying to piece together what the life of someone like my great-grandmother would have been to resurrect my family history and piece it together as best as I could. And what I discovered is that, with the exception of some of the periodicals, that Black women who came to New York at the turn of the century really were invisible. It was really difficult to find their stories. And my research really led me to the play Intimate Apparel, which is about Esther, who's someone very similar to my great-grandmother. She's a gifted seamstress who lives in a boarding house that's run by Mrs. Dixon, who's this grand dame of a woman. And Esther makes corsets and undergarments for her clients that range from Mrs. Van Buren, who is this wealthy Fifth Avenue socialite but extremely lonely, and Mamie, who's a Black prostitute who works in a brothel that's in the Tenderloin, who's just bursting with life and wants to be a singer, but she's trapped by circumstance. And Esther has another person who she goes to, which is Mr. Marks, where she buys her fabric, and he's an Orthodox Jewish man, and they just share this love for fabric, and they have this special loving bond that they can't ever consummate because they can't teach each other. And at 35, Esther is still single and is looking for love. And she suddenly gets this letter out of the blue from this man in Panama who's named George, and he's mysterious. And he writes these beautiful romantic letters. But Esther is illiterate. And so she has to turn to her clients to help her read and write. And ultimately, when George arrives in New York City, he's not the man, surprise, surprise, that she expected. And so this play that I wrote, which really was something that I wrote for my mother and was truthful in emotion and really represented sort of where I was emotionally, which was missing my mother and just trying to figure out, how do you love something that is no longer there, something that you can't have. And the play was immensely popular. For about 2 years in America, it was the most produced play. And then sort of went on the university circuit. But I never dreamed that it would find another form until Ricky Ian Gordon, this wonderful composer, approached me and said, "Do you want to write an opera?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I kind of do want to write an opera." And Ricky, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. Um, I um, I had just finished writing it. I wrote an opera of Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath with Michael Corey, and it premiered in 2007. And at that time, Peter Gelb, who was taking over the Met, started a new program of commissioning new works. And it was sort of an interesting conceptual thing because they were commissioning these new works, but they weren't saying where they were for or what they were for. But it definitely felt like you wanted to be a part of these commissioning projects. And so they asked me to write a piece. And at the time, because I was working with Michael Corey, I started to work with him on something. And then Michael and I, after The Grapes of Wrath, we said yes to a lot of things, and he said yes to too many. And suddenly I just fired him one day, and I had no writer to work with.
I didn't know that.
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't know
Fired
that.
him. I was like, "You're out of here."
Oh my God.
So I had coffee with Lynn a long time ago at Cafe Mozart down the block from me, because Michael and I were asking her to be part of a project that she couldn't, at the time, she didn't have time for. And Lynn was on the Obie committee when my Orpheus and Eurydice won an Obie Award. And I thought, I'm going to read every play she ever wrote. And, so I went on a Lynn Nottage campaign and I read everything. And of course, when I read Intimate Apparel, it was like strange. I entered it so deeply. And in a way, I feel like I was Mr. Marx when I was reading that play, And so I Facebooked Lynn. I said, "Do you want to write an opera for the Met with me?" And she said, and I don't know, you don't remember. The way I remember it, Lynn, is you said, "Yes, I've always thought my play, Intimate Apparel, was an opera."
No, that's not how I remember it. What the story is, Ricky is, and you didn't even say the Met. You said, are you interested in writing opera? And I said yes. And then we spent a year looking at different stories and trying to figure out what opera we wanted to write together. And it's only after you said, the thing I really want to do is Intimate Apparel. And then I said, the thing I really want to do is Intimate Apparel. But it took us a long time to arrive at that.
It's so funny. It's like the telephone game.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, when we arrived at Intimate Apparel, it was exactly right. I mean, it's so clearly the piece that it, for one thing, it just plays at my strengths in terms of it's such an invitation to, I am basically a trash can of American music, and it plays to those strengths that and the idea of the Lower East Side of New York and the growing out of ragtime. And it was a perfect piece for me. And then really just began the campaign of you writing a libretto, which just meant you boiling the play down to stock and adjusting to the notion that the music tells a lot of the story. And in that way, I would say it was really harmonious, because you just didn't bring a lot of ego to the table, Lynn. You just were like, "Oh, okay, less words." It was easy to say it. And so then by the third draft, it was a dream. It was stunning. And it was also, it was a really lucky, fortuitous thing for me because they were lovely words to set to music and a magnificent story and incredible characters. It was just, it was a very transformative piece to write. And clearly, luckily, that has translated.
Yeah, it's so true. It did, it took a while, but the entire journey felt effortless and right, which is rare. And I was a complete and total neophyte to the writing of a libretto, and I thought that you were an immensely gentle and thoughtful guide through the process. Particularly when I rewrote my play twice, and you said if we do this, it's going to end up being 4.5 hours.
I was
You
like,
have to
you're
figure out a
calling
way
for
to
the
whittle
rain.
it down. And but maybe we should share the first clip in the
Yeah.
piece. And the piece that that I'm going to present is of Mamie, who's the prostitute in the brothel, and who is a client and a friend of Esther's. And in the play, we only see Mamie in her her boudoir. But one of the wonderful things about translating the play to an opera is that I had the opportunity to take my characters into other spaces that they discuss, but we never get to see them on the stage. And so I really was interested in what Mamie's life was in on the floor of the saloon where she works. And this clip is her singing the Opium Rag. And Ricky, do you want to talk a little bit about the music?
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly that to get into the world of the piece, the first thing I did was I got a residency at Banff in Canada, and I wrote a huge. I thought I'm going to write a huge two-step or a huge rag, and I did. It was like practically 10 minutes this rag, and I entered the piece that way, and so I found a lot of the themes and the subject matter in this one huge rag I wrote. So what Mamie is singing is an opium rag, and it was the I had already stirred around these themes in this first thing that I had written at Banff.
And that was Christy Swan,
Yeah.
who is a wonderful and fearless performer. And one of the things that I loved about making this opera is that we really had an opportunity to delve deeply into the rehearsal process and develop the characters in ways that are unusual for making work for the opera stage. And we had the opportunity to rehearse the work for a month and to unpack not only the characters but also unpack the music and to edit and refine and to go inside of the work in ways that were very unusual for the process. And I
It's
know
not even
I'm new to
unusual, it's
opera, but
unheard of.
Ricky, you can
Yeah.
talk about just how different this process was.
Yeah. It's it's completely different. Like in, for example, when you open a piece like The Grapes of Wrath, it's basically you get two dress rehearsals and then you open for critics all over the world. And it's like running the gauntlet. It's barbaric, frankly. Whereas with Intimate Apparel, and it's interesting because watching that video, these videos are from 2 years ago when we were closed down because of COVID. So it's very early in the process in a way. We've come a long way, and it's very different and much deeper because it just is, because we've had more time to live with the material. But so with this process, we rehearsed like we were an actual show, previews in front of an audience, watching it, changing it, shaping it. And I should say too that you'll hear that one of the decisions I made early on was to orchestrate the piece for two pianos rather than an orchestra, because one of the interesting things about the piece is we're in a tiny theater. We're in like a 300-seat theater. And if I wanted any kind of orchestra, they couldn't have even been there. They would have to be in another room. Whereas the two pianos are there, they're on stage. It adds to this feeling of like a salon. of this happening in a bar or a saloon. But yeah, it's a kind of luxury that you never have in the opera world. When I just opened Garden of the Finzi-Continis, it was like that. It was 2 dress rehearsals, and then we opened. And what I learned, frankly, is I won't do it anymore.
Yes.
Like the way Intimate Apparel happened is the only way I will do another opera. Now, that doesn't mean another opera company is not going to give me a month to preview an opera, but I will not take the bread out of the oven until I feel like it's baked. It's not fair.
But that's so true. And I remember when we did sit down with Peter Gelb and with Andre Bishop, and we're deciding ultimately what shape this piece would take, whether we were going to blow it up for the big Met stage or whether we were going to turn it more into a chamber piece, which ultimately it is with these 2 pianos, is that not only was it about orchestrating this in a way that was different, but also understanding that we wanted to make an opera that was accessible. That so often the Met stage, because of the grandness of those shows,
Yes.
and the expense of the ticket prices, that a lot of people don't feel welcomed across the threshold. And we thought, we don't want to build an opera like that. We want an opera that can go anywhere, that's nimble, that can go in a small theater, that can go in a grand opera house, but that everyone will feel invited to see it. And that was super important. And so that will lead me into this next clip, which is Mamie and Esther have finally the opportunity to dream about their world that's just outside of their reach. As I said earlier, that they're both these women who are trapped by circumstance, but together they finally give each other permission to dream. And so the piece that we're going to present is called No One Does It For Us.
For us.
Can I just say
Yeah.
before you do that was Kirsten Piper Brown, who's a wonderful
Yes.
soprano, who came to us via Rochester, someone who hadn't been working a lot in New York, had raised her 2 children, and bought herself a ticket to come down to New York because she wanted to get back in the game. So go on, Ricky. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
She's
interrupt
a
you.
star. No, I just was going to say that also, that No One Does It For Us. It's like, I knew when I read your lyric, I was like, this is a number. You know what I mean? Like, in terms of the way I play around with the notion of, is it opera, is it a musical, and blurring those lines, I could just read what you had written and think, oh, this is going to be one of those places where it's very blurry about whether this is a musical or an opera. And I really had fun writing this whole section. I mean, right at the moment when she says, open the door, suddenly it turns into a beauty parlor, and Mamie's getting like a manicure and a pedicure. So
Yeah, and it was also I really enjoyed expanding this moment because it was one of my favorite moments in the play, but because of the nature of that particular work, it was kept very sort of small.
yes.
And
Yeah.
in this way, I was able to expand it and invite other people into the world of Esther and Mamie, and it becomes this really delicious, delightful moment, and much more buoyant than many of the other arias that are in the piece. And I thought it was particularly beautiful and moving.
So
And
you
so,
never told me that.
oh, I didn't tell you
No,
that.
I love
I,
knowing
I
that.
think we talked about that.
I feel like I never knew that. Like, the one thing I didn't say is that once we decided to do Intimate Apparel, that Peter Gelb and Andre Bishop wanted to know how you would open the play. But to hear you say that, what a lovely thing that was to open that scene up that way, it makes me feel warm inside. I love that.
I think that was one of the things that I relished most about this entire process is figuring out ways in which I could sort of circumvent the conceit that I gave to myself for this play.
Right.
Because originally, when I wrote it, it was like La Ronde. It was I had decided that each scene would be 2 people standing over a bed, and I was really interested in the way in which a bed, the presence of a bed, shifted the interactions between folks, even if the intent was not an intimate one.
Yes. Yeah.
And so when I was thinking about expanding this into an opera, I thought, well, now I'm going to have to think beyond this very tight conceit that I had imposed upon myself. And there was something very liberating about saying, okay, I no longer have to have two people in a scene in which they're stuck in a boudoir and sort of talking across a bed. And it was really sort of a delightful exercise to figure out how to expand this world of Esther, but keep it very true to the initial impulse of the play.
Yes, and you did it so beautifully, but also it was a great opportunity for me to, if there was more orchestration than two pianos, it's that I had more people in the room. And so if people see the piece, the choral writing, it's as if the voices are woven throughout the piece. Sometimes they're like strings. Sometimes they're workers on the Panama Canal. Sometimes they're beauticians. Sometimes they're housemaids. But it was such an elegant way to open the play, I think.
And so the third clip that we're going to share tonight is Esther and Mamie composing one of the letters to George. Because Esther can't read or write, she's really dependent on her friends to help her shape the letters. And she asked each of them to use their own desires as a guide. And then in this clip, I think we hear George respond. And George is played by the wonderfully talented Justin Austin. It's interesting watching that clip because it's changed a tiny bit, because that's pre-COVID, and one of the lovely opportunities that we had because of the 2-year COVID pause was the ability to go back in and rewrite some of the things that we didn't have time to adjust when we were doing the initial rehearsal process. And so I'm so happy that we had, you know, all of that space to revisit the piece, and I just feel like it's stronger as a result.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I went upstate the day we closed, March 12th, 2020, and I spent about a month and a half rewriting the piece just based on what we had watched in front of an audience. You know, hearing the two pianos and thinking that could have more color there, it was such a luxury, you know, to do that. It was really wonderful.
Because I just remember our profound disappointment because we were in the middle of the preview process. We didn't even open the piece when the pandemic hit. And we really did think, I remember it was March 13th, and we thought, we're going to be back on April 15th next month to do the show. And the performers didn't even move their things out of the dressing rooms. And 2 years later, when we returned to the theater, everything was intact. It was exactly as we left it. Yeah, it was great expectations. It was kind of frozen in time. But the piece had changed because we had this opportunity, which is so rare in opera, to dig in and make adjustments.
And we'd all grown as people. We had more to say after those 2 years away from the piece.
But also thinking about George's letters, it's one of the few things that were almost untouched from the play to the libretto.
That's nice.
And I remember you saying to me, when I was beginning to dig into some of George's letters, I mean, they're slightly trimmed. You said, I don't think you need to change anything. I think that I can find the music in it as you have written it.
Yeah, they're gorgeous. You know, and Lynn, I don't even know if you know this, but of course, the score will be published, but I want to publish George's letters separately as
that would be lovely.
Arias for baritone, because they're good.
And so I guess this final clip that we're going to share is from the top of the second act, and it's one of my favorite moments in the play. It's after George has arrived in New York, and Esther, for the first time, realizes that he isn't this romantic, idealized man that she'd been writing to, and his language is coarser, and his presence is a little rough and unfamiliar, and she has to, in this moment, negotiate being intimate with a stranger.
That's amazing, you guys. Thank you for sharing all that work. That helps place all of this conversation in a great context. And hopefully, many of the folks who are watching have already seen it. Hopefully, and if they haven't, they have just a few more minutes to catch it. Right.
Really.
Yeah, they have. This is the last weekend.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So we've got about half an hour to go before we wrap up, and so I want to make sure that we give a chance for the audience to ask some questions. But I have a few. I have many that I could ask. I could take the whole time, but I won't. About your work together. And Lynn, I thought I would start actually with you, just sort of asking you. I mean, you spoke about the opportunity to kind of dive into the piece, particularly in the last 2 years, but even initially in such an unconventional rehearsal process for an opera. And I wonder, uh, particularly once you settled upon the idea of returning to this play, what it was for you to kind of look at this with new eyes, with a significant amount of distance from the time that you actually wrote it. Obviously, based on what you said earlier, it's quite a personal play for you in terms of your own family history. But of course, our feelings and our memories evolve over time, and I'm wondering what it was like for you to kind of return to the narrative and to see different elements of it that you might have wanted to lift out, or even as you were kind of condensing the story and reshaping it, how your own personal relationship to the story informed that, I guess.
I know that's such a great question, Christian. It really was like meeting an old friend at a reunion. You hadn't seen for a long time, and you thought, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you," but you suddenly see all of their flaws.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so that was the experience of looking at something that was, which I loved and I still love, but suddenly seeing it with some distance and understanding that there are things that I wanted to fix, and that I had this second, this blessing of a second opportunity to dig in and to go deeper. And in particular, I felt like the character that I wanted to look at, George, because I felt after we initially did Intimate Apparel, there were so many questions about the why around him and the choices that he made. And, in the initial production, he was viewed as a villain, which I always found somewhat perplexing because I never saw him in that way. I always saw him in the context of all of the other characters who were these flawed people who were looking for love in all the wrong ways and in all of the wrong places, and were victims of circumstance. And I felt like that wasn't entirely clear in the play, and I thought I have this opportunity to go back in and really help people understand the journey that George took, which is this man who, like Esther, wanted love and was sort of lured to New York, and when he arrives in New York, finds that the reality is very different than he imagined, because he was reading these beautiful letters that painted a very glossy picture. And he finds that the things that made him a great worker in Panama are not valued in New York, and his language is not appreciated, and he struggles. And so I wanted to show that journey, and that's something that I was able to do.
Yeah, that's great. It's. I think that having seen the original production, I could feel the complexity of that character having grown so much in this portrait of it. Ricky, I'm wondering, you spoke about how easily you entered this play, and I'm wondering. I mean, I saw Morgan Janessa's comment in the Q&A, but because she's here watching,
Oh,
but I'm
what was her
curious.
comment?
It was a question comment slash
Okay.
comment, and which I'm sort of rephrasing, which is,
Okay.
um, what was your point of entry into the material? Because it's clear from listening to you even talk about the process that you really do have a very personal feeling, not just about your own work on it, but about the story and about the play itself. And I'm curious to know more about how you entered this world.
Well, first, I want to piggyback in answering you, Christian, off of something Lynn said, which is that what she was saying about clarifying George,
Yeah.
this is something music is great at, right? because George in Act One, as far as I'm concerned, is fantasy George,
Yeah.
right? George is whoever George is in Esther's head.
Mhm.
And so for me, that means George is legato, and all of his musical lines are romantic, and his high notes soar, and you want to sleep with him when he sings, you know what I mean? And in Act Two, he becomes percussive and angular and clipped, right? And that is something that music is great at, defining character, you know. So and what the entry point for me in terms of Lynn's play is the idea what she was just talking about, that everyone is lonely and desperate for love. I mean, at the end, when you know, Mamie says to Esther, why did you give him all that money? And Esther says, I wanted to be held. You know, I wanted to see what it felt like to be held by someone, to be loved by someone. And who doesn't identify with that?
Right.
And then the fact that, you know, that there is at the center of this play, there for me, there is this little Jewish man selling fabric on the Lower East Side. I felt like, oh my God. And there I am in the middle of the play, like every time on Orchard Street with my little fabric. And everything about those scenes, it was like, I am going to sew. I mean, my grandmother worked at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. On the day of the fire, she was home sick, and her mother dragged her to the factory to see her friends flying out the window like angels on fire. So the idea of this little man and the Lower East Side, and I've put that in, that was in my opera Morning Store, but it just, there was nothing but entry points. And when Lynn says that she doesn't see George as a villain, oh my God, I don't either. What I see is, I see a man who came to New York with nothing but willingness, and all of his willingness was crushed. And what he is by the end of this play is someone who has dealt with one no after another. And who doesn't? I mean, I open, you know, anything and like run the gauntlet of critics, and I feel like George by, you know, the second act. So it's like, it's such a, not only is it a beautiful, brilliant play to me, but it's so easy to understand. And, you know, I should just say really quickly that I'm really glad you cut us off before I got to sing and play. But I was going to say, there is a moment when Lynn gets to, when finally George knocks and she doesn't want Mamie to let him in. And she has this one lyric that Lynn wrote, and I have to quote it, because there's always a moment in a libretto where my head explodes. And it's just these 4 lines where she says to Mamie, let him go. He ain't real. He just an unanswered letter. He just a feather on the wind. Open that door and we be chasing him forever. And that says it all as far as I'm concerned. It's like, if you want to know why I wrote the opera, those are the lines.
If you still want to sing and play, I don't mean to stop you.
No, absolutely. I think the question and answer period is right.
Good. I'm curious.
But I will say this, one of the real pleasures of building this opera with Ricky is that at like 7 in the morning, I'd get a text from Ricky. He's like, you have to come to my house immediately. And I'd race up to the Upper West Side, and he'd sit me down on a piano stool, and he would sing an aria, and it was just a treat. And that went on for 2 years, and I so appreciated those moments.
That's amazing. I want to invite anybody in the audience who has questions to start putting them in the Q&A, so that after I have 1 or 2 more with them, I can start to turn to yours. So please feel free, if you've got questions, to put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, I could just keep going. To your point, Lynn, actually, what I was going to ask you was, as you as you began to work together on this, can you characterize a little bit the back and forth? Because it seems to me an interesting challenge to, on the one hand, you started with a play that was whole and finished and published, and so you were going back into it from your own angle, but also incorporating this whole new vocabulary of music and composition and character being informed by a musical language that the play had in terms of its language, but it didn't have literal music in it that way before, right? And so I'm curious to know what it was like to sort of pass the material back and forth, and how the thing evolved.
I know it's interesting because when we began the process, we talked a great deal about the vocabulary and what we wanted to sound like. And as I was writing it, I was listening it to some ragtime and to some very specific music, and I shared that with Ricky and said, "This is what I hear and this is what I see." And he's like, "Thank you, because it really helps me to begin to imagine the soundscape." But when you write the libretto, it really is an act of surrender. It's unlike musical theater, where there's a lot of give and take and you're sort of constantly rewriting. In the libretto, I gave it to Ricky and had to wait for him to fill in all of the blanks, which he did so beautifully. And it wasn't quite the same kind of dialogue that you would have in musical theater, and that's something that I had to let go of, because I am so used to a very specific kind of collaboration in which I get to say, you know what, I don't like that. Yeah. But Ricky did such a beautiful job. Fortunately, I didn't have to cringe and bear it.
But Christian, I do have one moment I have to recount.
Please do.
We had a dramaturg on the piece named Paul
Yes.
Primo from the Met, and there was one really funny moment where we went to do a workshop of the piece in Cincinnati, and one day we present, we work through Act 2, and all of a sudden Lynn looks sick. She's like, "Oh my God!"
Oh no!
And I was like, "What?" She goes, "We dramaturged a major moment right out of the piece." And it was like a major moment where
it was a major moment. We dramaturged a major moment out.
Right out. It's where George goes to touch her after he's ruined her life. And she goes, "No, don't touch me. I ain't going to let you hurt me. I'm a good, decent woman. Worthy. Yes, worthy." And I was like, "Chill, Lynn. I'll put it back in the piece." And then I came back to New York and put it in. And Lynn, don't you love that moment?
I do love the moment, and I fought for that moment. And it's funny, and we should give a particular shout out to Paul Primo, who was our dramaturg, and who really was a translator for both of us when we were figuring out how to work together for the first time. And he just was so gentle in the way in which he gave feedback, and really helped us find not only the libretto, but the opera.
Yeah, and he really did, because Paul could say things to Lynn, like I could say, "There's too many words," and I still know it, and I can tell by what it looks like on the page. But Paul was detailed and specific, and he really labored. He was really helpful.
And deeply thoughtful, which I appreciated, is that, sometimes you feel when you're working with something that they have an agenda, and I felt like he didn't have any agenda other than helping us arrive at the place that we wanted to go.
He wanted us to write a beautiful opera because it does reflect on this whole commissioning program. It's nice that our opera did well, because it's the first time the Met ever commissioned an opera that was done at the Lincoln Center Theater. It's the first time those arts organizations collaborated. So it is a lovely thing that it's been sort of a good thing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I found it thrilling, frankly. I mean, I was somebody who goes to see stuff at Lincoln Center Theater all the time, and goes to I go to the opera as well, but much less frequently, to sit in an audience there of theater goers as much as opera goers, probably more so than opera goers, right? And to watch them sort of fall into this world and into this vocabulary of opera, which they probably walk in. I don't know what your experience of it, and maybe this is the next question, which is like, what was it like to sort of watch the audience watch it? Because they, I think they probably walked in with a lot of assumptions about what an opera is going to be like.
That's a really good question, Christian. And I think that it was a bittersweet, to be honest, a bittersweet experience, because I felt at moments that the audience wasn't properly primed to understand that what they were going to be experiencing was
Yeah.
an opera. I think that there was a percentage, particularly early on, of people who thought they were going to come and see the play.
Oh, or a musical.
Intimate Apparel,
Yeah.
who the minute Esther began to sing, you'd see them look down at their program, panicked, and be like, "What is this?" I
Oh
kid you
no.
not. And then there
Okay.
were people who expected it to be musical theater and who just didn't know how to listen to opera and weren't willing to really meet the piece where it was. And not only does the program say Intimate Apparel, the opera, we had to put a special insert into the
Yeah.
program with gigantic letters that said, "This is an opera," for people who didn't understand that that's what it means when it says Intimate Apparel, the opera. So I think that it was a wonderful thing for this piece to be at Lincoln Center, and I think that the next collaboration between the Met and Lincoln Center won't have the same early challenges that we had, which is really educating an audience that doesn't know that much about opera.
Yeah, yeah, it's partly the subscription problem, right? I mean, sort of the membership problem, right? It's like they're coming, many people are coming without any real foreknowledge of what they're about to see.
No,
Yeah, yeah,
and not conditioned,
right.
Wait,
to go to the
Lynn,
opera.
can I tell my one story?
Oh
I
yeah,
went
please
first.
tell your story.
All right, so we're in early previews, and there are two women sitting in front of me, and it's right after the intermission, and everyone's about to sit down for act two, and they start putting on their coats, and I said, "Are you leaving?" And one of them turns around and she goes, "Yeah, I find the music tedious." And so I went like, "Oh, I wrote it." And then she goes, "Oh, I mean, what happens in Act Two?" And I said, "I'm not going to tell you what happens in Act Two. Get the F out of here." And I kicked them out of the theater.
Good for you. Good for you. People need to be polite at the very least. Um, so I'm going to turn to some of these questions from the audience in our last several minutes here. Uh, there's the first question on here actually, which I think is an interesting one, which is uh, this person wanted to know more about the play as sort of about one woman's work in New York City at a particular time, and how does the sort of question of labor as a theme uh, fit into fit into your sense of your work as a whole, especially with Sweat and certainly with Clyde's recently. Like, how do you see a connection of through all these things?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a thesis, and,
Yeah.
and that will take much longer than we have tonight. But it's definitely centered to what I'm interested in as a playwright, is putting representations, realistic representations of people, working people on the stage, because that's who I am, and that's where I come from. And as a black woman, who has not only been marginalized in every aspect of my life, but also has felt marginalized in terms of the way in which we approached the telling of stories. And so I really feel that it's essential in my own art practice that I tell the stories of the people who have shaped me, and those are workers. Esther is really a representation of my great grandmother, who was a seamstress in Sweat. While my family were not steel workers, they were workers who at various points in their lives, for various circumstances, found themselves locked out of opportunity. And I certainly have experienced that as an art worker and a theater maker, and I understand financial instability and what it is to sort of struggle with your craft and not necessarily be recognized for it. And so I think that that's become a theme that is interwoven in all of the plays that I write.
Yeah. And obviously that was something that resonated for you too, Ricky, with your own family history. I mean,
Oh, like completely. I mean, my father became an electrician because first of all, there was so much anti-Semitism after World War II in New York. And if you were a Jew and you didn't want to be a furrier or work in the garment industry, electrician was a good thing because it was so dangerous. Nobody wanted to do it. and he was willing to do anything rather than cut fur and fabric. So yeah, and I definitely, of course, my path is different than Lynn's, but believe me, it took me a while to be recognized for what I do.
Sure. So that actually leads me to the sort of the next question that I was going to take on, which was one of the audience members was particularly interested in the relationship between Esther and Mr. Marks, and I wonder, and was just wondering if both of you could speak about your sort of take on that relationship and whether that evolved. And I would add, did your sort of point of view on that evolve as you continued to work on the play again?
This play, as I mentioned at the very top, was a deeply personal play, and I was exploring some family themes when I was writing it. And I put Mr. Marks in the play because my husband, who's a Romanian Jew, I was imagining at the turn of the century, if we had encountered each other, would we be able to consummate that relationship? And I was also interested in putting on stage an intimacy of two people who were deeply in love, but because of race and religion, were unable to touch and had to figure out ways in which to communicate that love without ever touching.
That's great. That's great. And what about you, Ricky? What was your thinking about that?
Well, even when Linwood said what she just said, I always feel like at the end of the piece that for me, it's a happy ending because loving someone and not being able to touch them is still love. And loving someone and not being able to to be touched back by them is still love. And love, when it exists in your heart, is magnificent. And I feel like what exists between Esther and Mr. Marks is huge. And, I get to pour myself into Mr. Marks. I mean, obviously, when Lynn wrote the lyric for when Esther says, "Why do you always wear black?" And he sings that aria, "My father's suit." And I wove all these Jewish themes into the piece, like right when you first meet Mr. Marks, and there's a little clarinet riff, which is on the piano, and all these sort of klezmery sounds in my own voice. But those scenes between Esther and Mr. Marks are, they are different for me. And it's not, I love all these characters. So it's not like one scene is less for me than another, but they are just, they have this specialness of that I decided to cast myself as Mr. Marks.
Yeah. One of the other questions actually is sort of on this same theme of sort of how you cast yourself, and then therefore how you choose the particular kind of musical palette that you use in composing this, right? And that and one of the things that I loved about listening to it, and the questioner did as well, was, sort of becoming aware as you listen that there's a particular style that's being referenced, or a particular period, like a particular kind of theme, or an influence that's being reflected. And I wonder, you obviously have a very big toolbox of styles that you can work in, and I'm wondering how do you go about sort of aligning a moment, or aligning a character, or aligning, like, how talk a little bit about that process.
Everything is story, and people always want to know the score. Absolutely arises out of the story. It arises out of the characters. You enter a story, and then the music starts taking shape in terms of, it's your dramatic instincts that tell you what a scene should feel like, how it should be paced, and what it should sound like. And it's the same with setting a poem to music. I memorize a poem, I let it marinate inside of me, and I don't make a gesture on that poem's behalf until it feels organic, until I feel like that poem is roiling inside of me. The story of Intimate Apparel was roiling inside of me, and the story tells you the music it needs. It feels like, it's a funny feeling because people say, what is it like to, before you've written an opera, you feel it's like a shadow pressing against your back, and it's almost depressive. Like you can't exactly hear the notes, but you start getting the feeling of it. And then when you start the notes start coming out, it just starts sort of unfolding.
And
You know?
can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
Is that when Ricky and I were discussing the opera, we were really interested in the fact that it takes place at the birth of modern America, when you had a confluence of all of these cultures that were coming into dialogue for the very first time, and we're thinking about what is this soundscape going to be. And so it really had to feel like a collision of cultures, of African and Americana and Jewish immigrant. And what does that sound like without it feeling like pastiche? And how do you create something that feels like it always existed but is new?
Mhm.
Yeah, like there's this great moment that I always love where George ends his second letter. And as he's about to say George Armstrong, right when he's singing Armstrong, suddenly the people, street sellers and on the Lower East Side are selling their wares. And that was a big, by the way, that was a big Bartlett Share thing too. Bart, who the director was, when I first wrote the piece, there were all these cadences, scenes
Mhm.
began and ended. And when I started to see what Bart was doing, I realized, oh, Bart is sort of making things very cinematic, isn't he, with that turntable? And I started cutting the cadences and letting scenes bleed into one another, which was another very liberating thing.
Yeah.
Right, Lynn?
One of the things that I know we're gonna have to wrap in a minute, but one of the things that I sort of really viscerally experienced watching it was for to be I mean to sound slightly corny, was that the experience was extremely intimate, right? I mean that the and inclusive of that turntable, that the turntable kept pushing the characters basically towards me, right? I mean, like that there's a an immediate relationship between the audience and the action of the play in that space that is very unusual for the form, certainly of opera, but was also reflected in the extreme detail of the performances. I think operatic actors are not often given credit for being good actors, and this group of people was extremely detailed and precise in a way that maybe they don't even get to normally work. Right?
You
I mean, to
don't.
your point about
No,
the rehearsal process, they don't get to spend their
they
time on
won't again.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, what was unusual is that they actually had the time to develop character, to
that.
go in deep. And one of the other unusual things about this opera, which is sacrilege for many people from the opera world, is that the performers were mic'd.
Yeah. Hmm.
And what the miking allowed them to do is much more delicate, gentle, intimate
Hmm.
singing. So, because at the Met, in order for people to hear, people have to go, deep down into their diaphragm and blow that air out so that people all the way in the back can hear it. But here, they could whisper for the first time, and you could hear you could hear the storytelling in ways that you don't when you're at the Met, because it's blasted.
Yes. Yeah.
Christian, just to say on what Lynn just said, I would say the deepest part of my aesthetic as a theater artist is that my greatest love when I was a kid was foreign film. And foreign film to me is all about close ups. And Intimate Apparel is like an opera of close ups.
Hmm.
And we got to do that because of the space we're in.
Yeah.
And that is what's very fulfilling about it. If you're in the Met is 4,000 seats. And from the front row, people are still 50 feet from you because you have that pit. But here you are it is happening right in front of you.
Yeah, it's an incredible, and it's, I think, in keeping with what we were just talking about, Lynn, with the themes of the play and where it's situated in 20th century American culture, and where the marginalization of those characters is such a huge driver of their own longing, and their own sense of themselves. It's especially wonderful that it ended up situated in that space at Lincoln Center, which was built as such a monument to a certain kind of culture and can seem so kind of impenetrable as a fortress to a
I
lot of
know
people.
it's like the mere presence of this opera is disruptive in that space.
Yeah,
You know,
Yes.
from the bodies that are occupying it to the form that's occupying it.
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
It's
Absolutely.
amazing. Yeah, it really wakes up that place
Yeah.
in a really wonderful way. Well, unfortunately, we need to wrap up, but I want to thank you both so much for this conversation. I could keep talking to you about it all night. And congratulations again. It was a thrilling production. I hope any of you who are listening and here tonight who haven't gotten a chance will try to rush it in the next several days if you can.
But also, if you don't have this opportunity to see it over this weekend, that it's being filmed on Saturday by great
Right.
performances and will be on PBS next fall.
Yes.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we'll all look forward to that. Um, so thanks again, everyone, and I think we'll just wrap up there. I want to just offer you a lot of our appreciation and thanks to everybody for coming tonight and for being here. I'm sorry I couldn't get to more of the questions, but I think it was a really fantastic conversation. So
Thank you.
have a good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Hello?